Okay, everyone, thank you for coming out to the Python workshop. We have Nina here, and she is a senior cloud developer advocate for Microsoft. Thank you so much, Nina, for agreeing to do this workshop for everyone, and I will pass it off to you.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to speak to women and non-binary folks in InfoSec and teach them a little bit of Python. So we're going to talk today about doing a quick intro to Python and the really popular request library to work with APIs in approximately 45 minutes. So in this screencast, you're going to learn a little bit about the anatomy of an API call, what to look for in a request and a response, and how to differentiate between different HTTP status codes. Once you have this foundation, you're going to learn the basics of using VS Code to interact with Python. Just a quick thing about me, like you heard, my name is Nina Zakharenko, and I'm a senior cloud developer advocate at Microsoft focusing on Python. Before that, I have about a decade of experience doing engineering for companies like Reddit, Meetup, and HBO. If you want to follow me around the web, NNJA, that's like ninja without the I, on Twitter, GitHub, and LinkedIn. This repository is going to live at, if you want to see all the code, it's going to live at github.com/NNJA/learn_requests. So the first thing that we're going to do, we want to do a little bit of a tech check and make sure that we have Python 3 installed. So open up VS Code or in your terminal, type Python 3 -- version. And you should see Python version 3.6 or above. If you're not, you might end up having a little bit of difficulty during the screencast. And I'm going to go a little bit fast today because I want to get through a lot of material. So don't worry if you can't keep up. All the material is on GitHub. You can always rewatch the screencast again. What's really important here is the concept. So now go ahead and open VS Code. And while you're doing that, I just want to tell you a little bit about VS Code. So it's a lightweight cross-platform editor from Microsoft. It works on Windows, Linux, and Mac. The nice thing about it is that it comes with almost nothing, not even spell check. And the power of VS Code really lies in the extensions, and there's a lot of excellent ones, great themes, key maps, and that lets you customize your editor exactly how you like it. So the first thing that we're going to do to work with a Python file is we're going to open up the extensions tab right here on the left side. It's kind of that square, and search for the Python extension. It should just be this one right here. It has 29 million downloads. If you see that, then you've got the right one. Go ahead and install it, and once that's done, it's going to prompt you to restart VS Code. Once you've done that, you're going to want to open the terminal inside your VS Code instance. So open up your VS Code again, either from the terminal or by clicking on the icon. When it asks you to browse to a folder, make sure that you've now browsed to your project folder. And open the terminal either by hitting Terminal, New Terminal in the menu bar above, or by hitting Control and backtick at the same time. That should open up a terminal for you. So make sure that you're in a project folder that you want to use. If you're not, make one. And before we get started, we want to create a virtual environment. A virtual environment is kind of like a container for all your dependencies for a specific Python project. That allows you to pin to specific versions of that dependency. So, your different projects don't get mixed up. If one needs a version 1 of Django and the other needs version 2 of Django, virtual environments let you keep those things separated. in order to do that, we're going to type Python 3-env, and then venv, that's the virtual environment package that comes with Python 3. And the second argument is going to be env. That's the folder where our virtual environment is going to go. And that's just going to take a minute. If you look in this directory now, you should see this .env folder. What is in .env? It's a separate copy of the Python interpreter that kind of exists in this little sandbox. So in order to activate it, you're going to need to source and then env bin activate. And now you should see, maybe your terminal's a little bit less tricked out than mine, but you should still see a env indicator to the left of your prompt showing that that virtual environment is activated. And to double check that, if I type which Python, I'll see that full path, and that my Python is now at env bin Python. Cool. Now that we have our virtual environment, which is nice, it's going to prevent those conflicting package versions. It's going to help keep our system clean. You have to remember that if you close your terminal and you open a new one, your virtual environment isn't going to be activated anymore. So when you do want to work on this project again, don't forget to activate the environment by typing source and then this path. And if that helps, you can even drop a note in the project folder with the instructions. If, on the other hand, you are done with the virtual environment, you want to remove it from your active shell, we're not going to do it right now because we want to keep the virtual environment open, but you can just type deactivate and that will clean out that. Now, since we created our virtual environment within VS Code, we want to make sure that we set it in VS Code so that VS Code knows which interpreter to use. In order to do that, you want to click on the blue bar on the bottom left-hand side. It'll say Python 3.7 or 3.6. Click on that. And then in the search bar, type env/bin/Python. Oops. And select that one because we want VS Code to use our virtual environment. The nice thing about VS Code is if you open it from the command line when you already have a virtual environment activated, it's going to pick that up right away. So easy peasy. Okay, now we can install libraries without polluting our global Python package. And before I dive into that, I want to give you a little bit of information about Python. So just a quick 3-minute Python overview for those of you who haven't worked with Python before, or maybe you don't know much about it. Many folks think that Python is just for scripting, but it's really not. It's a very powerful language. It's used for data science. It's responsible for some of the most popular sites on the internet, like Reddit. In other languages like Java or C++, you define scope with curly braces. And that's caused some interesting security bugs, like the famous Apple curly braces bug that messed up some of their SSL verification. In Python, though, you define scope with white space, meaning that white space is very important. So pay attention to it. Make sure you don't have any extra white space or not enough, because if you mess that up, your Python won't run. So for example, if I was to define a function, we'll see here that there's some white space after the function definition and the contents of and the code on line 4. That means that the code on line 4 belongs to the function defined in line 3 based on the indentation. Cool. The second thing is that Python's package manager is called pip. And the packages live in a repository called PyPI. That's PYPI. I always recommend investigating Python projects on their PyPI page before installing it to make sure that it's legit and that, you know, nefarious folks haven't capitalized on your typos for popular packages. So to take a quick look at PyPI for requests, we'll see that PyPI is at pypi.org. And looking around this page, we'll see that there's a project description, and it was last updated on December 10th, so it's active. You can take a look at the release history, project description, etc., but we're not really concerned with that right now. So we want to use pip to install the request package. It's a nice popular package that makes it a lot easier to work with APIs. And in order to do that, we want to make sure that our virtual environment is activated, and just type pip space install space requests. And when you hit enter, you should see some information about requests installing. Before I talk about how to use the request library, I want to chat a little bit about a few things about APIs. RESTful APIs are the most common ones, and they follow a well-defined formula that maps common HTTP operations like get, put, and post to operations on a data set. There are lots of APIs out there. Some of them are free to use, some of them are locked behind a paywall, some are open to everyone, others require some form of authentication. But the common theme, most APIs are rate limited to prevent someone from sending too many requests at once or in a certain small window. When you make a request of an API at a particular URL, that URL points to the data that you want to work with. You can also send along headers, and those headers are more details about what you're looking for, things like authorization tokens, maybe a content type. So if you're sending data, what format should the server expect it in? A lot of times, if you don't send along headers, the server is going to have some defaults. When the API gives you a response, it has a status code attached to it. The 200 status code means that everything went great. It's kind of the most common one there is 200 OK. A status code in the 300 range means it's a warning, like maybe something has moved. HTTP status codes in the 400 range, that means that there is a client error. For example, 404, you requested a resource that wasn't found, or maybe a 401, that the client had provided bad authentication credentials. The 500 error range means server error. But you have to remember that these are just guidelines, and there's quite a few silly HTTP status codes. For example, 418 is I'm a teapot, also sometimes called the hypertext coffee pot control protocol. And that is a real thing. I will link to the wiki page for this in the Git repo. But there is an implementation of HTC PCP, the hypertext coffee pot control protocol, seen right here. Okay, you're going to have to be a bit patient with me. My keyboard has decided to freak out, so when I want to use it again, I have to unplug it and plug it back in. Okay, sometimes there's data associated with that response. The type of that data is called a response type. It can come in lots of different formats: binary type, text, XML, most commonly JSON. JSON is a format for representing data with a bunch of extra curly braces that I don't really care for, but thankfully it's easy to work with in Python. And I talked a little bit about requests, but you should know that Python has a truly incredible standard library. But when the request framework came along, it really made interacting with APIs a lot easier. So let's use that. Okay, once you've installed requests, make a new file called api.py and open it in VS Code. You can either do that from the terminal, or you can use it from do that from this Explorer tab right here at the top It shows you your open editors and your file structures. You can right click here and say new file, or click on this new file icon right there. Okay, we installed I'm going to remove this. We installed the request library, so now we should be able to import it to use in our file. And I'm also going to import another really helpful library that's going to make my code a little bit easier to read. It's called pprint or prettyprint. That's included in the standard library, so we don't have to install anything else. And we just want to say from pprint, import pprint. The first API that we're going to work with is the Github API. They offer a few endpoints where we can grab some really interesting data from it without having to authenticate. But there is one catch here. Because we are unauthenticated, the Github API will only allow 60 unauthenticated requests per hour per IP. So that should be enough for the remainder of the workshop, but it's something to keep in mind when you're trying this at home. If you want to authenticate with GitHub, you can use username and password authentication, or GitHub offers token-based authentication. So you can create a new API token under your profile and then specify what permissions you want that token to have. For example, a token that allows you to only read information about your repositories, but not necessarily delete them. That's a much better security practice than just logging in with your username and password. Okay, great. So I'm going to define a variable with the URL of the GitHub API. That's accessible from the documentation, but you don't need to look at that right now. All you need to do is define a variable. I'm going to call mine API_URL, and we're going to point it at https://api.github.com. And the really nice thing about VS Code, if you want to run your code, run a selection of your code right in the terminal, it's really quick and easy. All you have to do is highlight it and then hit Shift and Enter. And that will run the code in the terminal below. Make sure that when you're making the selection, you're careful and you're kind of highlighting all the right things. For example, if I wanted to use requests and I did not highlight import requests, I would get an error. Okay, so let's make our first request. We're going to make a call to the API root, and the response is going to be all of the other API endpoints that we can explore. So I'm going to say my response is equal to request.get. Get here is mapped to the HTTP method get. Request also has all sorts of other methods like put, push, put, post, delete, etc. that map to the other HTTP methods. So we're just going to say request.get the URL at API URL. And the response is a full-blown object. So we can take a look at the response status code by printing that out. In Python, print is a function, so you just want to have parentheses around it. And I'm going to say my status code is, and then comma will just let me pass in other variables to print without needing plus or anything else fancy. And then I'm going to print out the response.status_code. Okay, so I'm going to run that by hitting Shift Enter. And we'll see that the response had a status code of 200, which is great. That means that my request was fulfilled successfully. Now let's take a quick look at what we got back from the server. In this case, by reading the documentation, we know that the server returns JSON by default. And luckily, because request is such a nice library, our response has a JSON method that has all the data that we want, all the data that we got back as JSON in a Python dictionary format. So I'm going to make a new variable here, response_JSON, and I'm going to assign that to our response.json and call that as a method. now if I take a look at this, and I print it out, I'm going to see a whole bunch of stuff. That's like a whole bunch of stuff. I can pretty print it to make it a little bit nicer. And highlight that. Okay, so calling the API at the root is going to return all the different other endpoints that I could possibly work with. There's a authorizations URL, code search, emojis URL, because that's very important. Everybody loves their emojis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can look up what all these different methods, or excuse me, what all these different endpoints do at the documentation for the GitHub API. Keep in mind that as I work with this response object, I'm not making any more calls to the API. This response is just the stored object in Python. Okay, so that's kind of the basics. Now let's check out some repositories. I know from reading the documentation that the URL for repos is the API URL plus / I believe it's repos. So if I print that out, you should see that that's that root URL that I defined earlier plus / repos. And just going to add that to my dictionary so that we stop seeing that squiggly green line. Okay, let's make a request to this new endpoint. So I've defined a new URL, and now I want to have a new response. I'm going to say, I call that one repos response. And now I'm going to say request.get repos URL. And I'm going to, copy all that code and run it. Let's check the HTTP status code and make sure that it's what we expect. Oh, it's a 404. Let's see. I think this is actually repositories. Let's try that one more time. Okay, great. Now I got a 200 response, meaning our request was okay. Cool. If we want to work with a particular object, we can usually pass in information about it as part of the URL. So let's get some information on one of my repositories. It's for setting a setup script for a new Mac and see how many stars it has. We do this by calling the repos endpoint and appending the owner and the repo name. And let's quickly take a look at this response before we do that, and look and see what's in there. Oops, and that's highlighted red because I'm just typoing that all up. Cool. Oh, it's a lot of stuff. So we don't always want to work with just a massive information. We usually want to narrow things down a little bit more. So there's another URL in this GitHub API that allows us to ask for information about a specific repo. The endpoint for that one is / repos, which not the best. It's a little bit confusing. One endpoint is repositories, the other one is repos. But I'm going to set that to / repos, and then the owner to myself / ninja, And then the target repo, the one I'm interested in getting information about, is at /new computer. So now I can compose my repo URL just by adding these together. API URL is the root, along with the endpoint that I want to hit, followed by the owner and the target repo. And let's print out that repo URL just to make sure that it looks how we expect it to. So I'm going to copy all of that and run it. So the API URL that we're going to call is api.github.com/repos/nnja/new-computer. Okay, let's call it. And let's check the status code. Okay, it's 200, awesome. That means that we did the right thing. Now, we're gonna get a kind of a lot of data back. Not quite as much data as this, but still quite a bit. So let's take a quick look at that. I'm going to assign the JSON to a variable so that I can use it again. So repo response.json is the method that I want to call, and repos_response_JSON is the variable that I want to save it to. It looks like I forgot a S here. Okay, let's print that out and see what it looks like. Okay, lots more stuff. What we want to do is we want to pull out the information that we want, the information that we're interested in from the dictionary that we created from the JSON response, and ignore everything else. So you'll get a rundown of what's available at this endpoint from the API documentation. Let me quickly show you what that looks like. So you would just Google for the developer.github.com v3 repos API documentation. The version of the API that I'm using is version 3, although that's totally unimportant. And here you'll kind of see all the available actions that you can take. You can list all the public repositories, et cetera, et cetera. It'll tell you if that endpoint takes any parameters, and it'll tell you what a sample response might look like. Okay. So how do we pull out information that we want from that JSON response? Well, one way that we can do that is looking at all the different keys in that JSON dictionary. JSON. Looks like, this is a list. Interesting. That doesn't look like the right response. Let me just rerun this and make sure that that I called the right thing. This doesn't look like the right endpoint. Let me take a quick look at that repo URL. Okay, that's that's looking more like it. So I had a little typo here. What I was actually interested in is this new variable repo_response, not repos_response, which is a variable that I had used before. Sorry, my mistake. I should be picking better variable names. But let's try this one more time and make sure that we are looking at the right stuff. Okay, so this looks like the right thing. It's kind of pointing to that repo that I had asked it to. And I can verify that by saying, let's see, repo response JSON. That should be a dictionary now. And I can look at the keys to see what data I might have available. I'm going to keyprint that. Okay, so this shows us all the dictionary keys. We have a deployments URL when the repo was created, et cetera, et cetera. But since we want to get the number of stars that this repo has, the key that we're interested in here is the stargazers count. So I'm just going to copy that. And now I can print out and say that my new computer repository has, X many stars. And let's make a variable for that. So we can say that the star count is the repo response JSON, and then we can access that by key. So the key that we want here is the stargazers count, and we'll replace that in the string. And let's print this out and see what happens. That's right. Our star count is a integer, and in Python you can't add strings and integers. So there's one extra step that we have to take here. We want to take the we want to convert our star count from a number to a string, and in Python we do that this way. Okay, awesome, it worked. I was able to pull out just a teeny bit of information from that long list of JSON by using the key that I was interested in. And now that I know that this repository has 287 stars. Okay, now what happens if we pass in bad data to the API? You might have seen that a little bit earlier when I typoed and made a flub, but let's show it one more time. Let's try to get a bad response. And we're gonna say request.get, and we're gonna use that API URL route. And let's say I'm going to call an endpoint at repositories, and then the user is doesn't, and then the repository is doesn't exist, right? So I'm pretty sure that's not out there on GitHub. Let's print the status code for that. And see what it is. Okay, that response is a 404. Status code 404 means that that resource doesn't exist. So in this case, we were expecting it, but if you see that status code at other times, know that there's usually a problem with the URL or some other way that you're requesting a resource. Okay, great. How do we pass in parameters that aren't necessarily part of the URL? We can either do that by, that aren't part of the root URL. We can either do that by passing data back into the API, or we can use parameters that modify that URL. Requests takes care of that under the hood, so we don't have to worry about constructing the URL. All that we need to do is specify a params dictionary. So let's say that we want to search for repositories from the GitHub API based on some criteria. And I'm going to pull up the docs page for this. Here's the search endpoint. And we want to search repositories. And here in the parameters list is what we can pass in. So the queue, name of queue is required. It's a string, a query string, that contains one or more search keywords. And I'm also interested in the sort parameter because that sorts the results of your query either by stars or forks or a few other options. So my goal is I want to use the GitHub API search endpoint to find the top 3 most popular Python repositories of all time based on the number of stars that they have. So here I'm going to want to define some parameters that I want to pass in. And like I said earlier, the options for what you can pass in and what you can expect back are generally defined by the API documentation. And you'll find that all APIs are different. Most of them kind of follow the guidelines for being a RESTful API, so having resources mapped to endpoints with particular HTTP status codes. But generally, that's where the similarities end. Not all APIs will have expect the same parameters. So a new Python dictionary, and I'm going to call it params. And to make a dictionary, I put in some curly braces, and then I define the items in my dictionary in between them. So the first key that I want to make is Q, because remember, that's our query, and it's required. And I'm going to say I want my language to be Python. And then for my next key, I'm going to just make sure that I put a comma there. I'm going to put sort, and I want the sort to be stars. Let's take a quick look at our dictionary and make sure that it looks how we expect it to. Great. Okay, now if I want to pass those params in with the request, what I have to do first, I want to define the URL that I want to use. In this case, it's the root URL, that API URL plus /search/repositories. And then I'm going to say that the repo search response is equal to request.get. I'm going to pass in that URL that I just made, like I've done before. But this time there's going to be a second argument called params. And I'm going to just set that to the params dictionary that we have up here. And let's run that. Okay, as you might guess, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that our status code is okay. Cool, it's 200. That means we did the right thing. Let's put the JSON data into a new variable. Cool. Again, we're going to kind of end up with a mountain of data, and this time we're not interested in a particular key. We're interested in sorting that data based on a number. So that's super easy to do in Python. If we wanted to pick out the first 3 repos, first we want to get the data that's in the items key, because when this particular API sends back a list, it sends back a list along with some data like how many values are in it, but we don't particularly care. So I'm just going to say that my items are in the JSON data at the items key. And then I can just say, give me the top 3 repos. And in Python, I can slice that list by putting a colon, which means give me everything from the start, and then 3, which means give me everything in that list from 0 to the 3rd item. And let's print that out and see what that looks like. Let's see. Items is not defined. Okay, looks like I had not done things in the correct sequence. So now, if I print out my type 3 repos, cool, I have a bunch of data. If we want to print out some interesting information about these repos, like their URL and the number of stars that we have, or that they have, we can just loop over them. So I'm just going to say, you don't have to type this in if you're following along, that we're going to print the info on the top 3 Python repos based on URL and number of stars. And we do that now. We have the top 3 repos in a list. So we're just going to say for repo in the top 3 repos, set the info. So the info is going to be, I'm going to use a %. Let's just, yeah, I'm going to use a different printing format that you might not have seen, but I'll explain it quickly. So %s means to substitute the values that I will be passing into the string with their string representation. So I would say %s repo has %s stars. And then the % symbol and parentheses. And in the parentheses, I'm going to put the items that I want to substitute in here. So for each repo, I'm going to get the URL also as a key. And that key is the HTML URL. And then I'm going to get the number of stars as a key from the Stargazer's URL. And now I should be able to pass in these 2 variables to the string and then print that out. Okay, let's see if this works. Oops. Okay, so I have something in my top 3 repos. And now if I do this for loop, I will see the top 3 repos right here. The first one is the Ansible repo with oops, that's not the right thing. URL stars. I'm going to run that again and see what happens. I'm sure I have made a typo somewhere and I don't know where, but the code in the repo for the screencast kind of has the most up-to-date version sans typo that will show the number of stars for each of these repos. The other nice thing about VS Code is you can, in this terminal, control-click to follow the link that is printed out. So that's really nice and handy. Remember that the code is here. It's a much nicer and cleaner copy. And just want to go over that this is just the basics. This is just enough to get you started with working with APIs in Python and with requests. I've covered all the basic topics, kind of just enough to show you how powerful Python and requests really is. Know that you can chain all of these together in a program, into a program that does so much more. And the next topics, if you're interested in this, the next topics that you should study are how to authenticate to these APIs, so how to pass in authentication info using requests, such as a username and password combination or with a token. And by the end of the day, I'm going to update the repo that I have linked to have all those links in the README. The next thing that you'll want to investigate is how to use the HTTP methods outside of GET. So for example, post to create resources or put to update them. And lastly, I highly recommend reading the request quick start guide. It does a really great job of presenting a lot of information and a lot of useful snippets of code in one concise area. And that's all the time that I have today. I am going to turn off my screencast and then open up the floor to questions. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hello. Thank you so much. The feedback that I'm getting in Twitch is that bravo clap and that you're a great teacher. And a wave. And
that's really nice.
Yeah, and thank you so much for doing this. I know I'm definitely gonna have it on slow motion and like do it myself, so thank you so much. Anyone have any other questions? Thank you.
Are there any questions from
great. Twitch? They just say thank you, this was great. And lots of like clapping and happy.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And I am going to stop streaming.
Yeah, before you do, does anyone have any Python specific questions? Not necessarily about what we learned today, because I'd be happy to take those as well. You might need to give Twitch like an extra 15 seconds to catch up.
Yeah. They're just asking, they said that the next steps were really helpful and useful info, and thank you for that. And then they were asking how to contact you. Oh, you see it.
Yeah, I just responded to that.
Okay.
Yeah, all the next steps, all the links that I talked about, I'm going to put in the README for that repository that I linked today. I just didn't have time to put that all together today. Looks like there's a question in the chat.
Okay, it says, that was great. How did you know what to pass into the parameters dictionary? I think I got that right.
So I got all that information from the GitHub API documentation. And I just put a link to that in the chat. Yeah, it's a little tricky because each API is different. Each one kind of wants different parameters. Each one has slightly different URLs. So it's really important to read the documentation pretty carefully, because if you mess anything up, you can kind of end up with unexpected errors.
And then they asked, do you have any good Python resources?
Yeah, so there's a few free books out there. One is The Hitchhiker's Guide to Python. You can buy a paper copy, or the book is free online. I'm teaching a live streamed Python class this March. I don't remember the dates off the top of my head, but let me grab the URL for that. The class is going to be on Front-End Masters, but it is going to stream for free live on the day of. So you would just have to go to the, I am not typing good today. Let me grab the URL for that. Okay, I will type that. I will post that in the Slack chat. And I'm also going to drop that into Twitch. Other good resources, I really, really like the Flask mega tutorial if you're interested in web programming. It's done by a guy, I think his name is Miguel Grinberg, and it is just like everything that you need to know to build a fully functioning web application in Python. Everything from OAuth to databases, user logins, profile handling, like error handling, basically everything in just a really, really great step-by-step format. And if you're someone like me who really learns the most by being hands-on, it's a great resource. Other ones are, if you can, I recommend checking out a Python Meetup group. If you kind of self-identify as kind of a woman or non-binary person, PyLadies is a really good resource. There tends to be a chapter in the same, in every state. Every kind of big city, there is a PyLadies chapter, and they're generally just really welcoming, and it's a really easy environment to learn in because there's no pressure. There tends to be a Python user group in each location, and there's Python conferences, many of them in the US, some all over the world. PyCon US is coming up in May, and it's a really great one. It's the biggest one. There's 4,000 attendees, but there's tutorials before the conference where generally they're really friendly to beginners. So if you kind of want to learn a lot in a short period of time, that's a great place to do it. Any other questions?
I think we're good on Twitch.
Awesome. Well, this is really great. I'm looking forward to seeing the recording and sharing that. Look out for the README, kind of, say by the end of the day. It'll be up by tomorrow.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Nina. And I'm going to end the recording now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.